Thank you. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a little about how I think we should interpret epidemiology, and then a little bit about what I think, or how I think the IARC epidemiology panels do things. And then I'm going to talk about some criticisms and responses to some recent IARC decisions. So how do I think we should interpret these studies? Well, the answer is cautiously. So why is that? Well, it's because it is so easy to be wrong. So why is that? Well, as John's already said this morning, each and every epidemiological finding in each and every study has one or more of these four possible explanations. It either shows a causal relationship. We can take the results at face value, and if they're positive, well, that is showing a cause and effect. Or there's something wrong with the data somewhere, and that's called bias. And you may know there's something wrong, but you don't know how much is wrong, and so you can't deal with it. Or there's some other variable which you haven't collected data on, or which you haven't put into the analysis, or which you haven't put into the analysis well enough, that is really causing the finding. And that is called confounding. Or it's just a chance finding. You've been unlucky. And if you did lots and lots of larger studies, it would all go to nothing. It would be spurious. And we can only establish a causal relationship by excluding those other three. And in practice, this is very difficult because we're dealing with observational data in the main and not experimental data. So how did Sir Richard Dole describe all this? This is going back a long time, 1984, although it doesn't seem that long ago to me, but apparently it is. And I'm putting this up because I don't think it's been put better. And I've put a few words in italics where I'm highlighting what he was saying. So he's saying we've got positive association, and he's talking about people with known exposures. So here he's directing towards cohort studies where you're using contemporaneous records rather than studies of volunteers where people are being asked to recall what they were exposed to. So we start off, it's not explicable by bias, confounding or chance, which we've already had. Then varies approximately with dose. A wonderful example, I think, of Dole's precise use of language, because he's put the word approximately in. So he's saying, this is not the National Physical Laboratory. You cannot expect perfection in epidemiology, but you want to see an approximate dose response. And then finally, is observed repeatedly in different circumstances. So don't do one study and say you've established something. Don't do two studies and say you've established something. You need to have more than that. So how do IARC, what definition do they use about establishing carcinogenicity? So again, I've got a few words in italics here for my emphasis. So they've got the category of sufficient evidence. So they say a causal relationship has been established. So established is a very strong word. It's the same word that Dole used. That is, a positive relationship has been observed. But they're not specifying here that it has to be a dose-response relationship. It could be something much simpler. And then in studies, so not a single study, but two studies count as studies, so not many studies, in which chance bias and confounding could be excluded, then with reasonable confidence. So not with confidence. So Dole was talking about establishing something, meaning you're confident. So this is reasonable confidence. I'm going to come on to what do we mean by being reasonably confident. And then there's another, the other important category, again this is about the human data, of limited evidence. So again we've got a positive association where the causal interpretation is considered to be credible. So here's the important word, credible. But chance bias and confounding could not be ruled out with reasonable confidence. So for the purpose of this talk, really to try and understand things myself as to how I thought IOP were doing it, I came up with this diagram. And the more I think about it, the more useful I think it is. But so far, these discussions have just been with myself. So I'm hoping to get some feedback later as to, is this useful? So the first column is where we would perhaps set ourselves with sort of stringent standards. We want very high quality data before we do something. And I'm putting, obviously, I've got a question mark at the end of IOP classification because this is just me imagining how they might be doing it. But I'm going from 0 to 100%. So there'll be some findings, so we might say smoking and lung cancer, we are almost completely confident this is real. To the nearest inch, we'd say 100%. One probably wouldn't like to say 100.000 because we want to always, perhaps as scientists, leave ourselves some room to sort of change our mind. But you're almost completely confident that smoking is right at the top of this graph. So in the first column, and 0 at the bottom, where you've got absolutely no confidence at all in the findings as being real. So here I'm imagining that you might say, if you say I'm 95% sure that this is real, then you would then go into this top sufficient evidence. So here I'm saying perhaps reasonable confidence means you're 95% confident. Years and years ago, I used to think that limited evidence in IARC meant you're really close to sufficient, but not quite. And here I've put it at 80%. So if you said, oh, I'm 80% sure these findings are real, you'd go into limited evidence. Well, that's clearly not how the IOP panels work. In the second column, I've called these modest demands. And so if you say, I'm 50% sure these findings are real, in other words, they're more likely than not to be real, which would be the standard you'd have in a civil case in litigation. If you say it's more likely than not to be real, that would be enough to put you into limited evidence. Well, I don't think that is how I do it either, because if that was the case, then having a limited evidence in human data would be enough to say it's a probable carcinogen, which, of course, in the IOP scheme, it isn't. So I think what is going on with the IOP panels is something more similar to the final column. And here we can imagine we've got some positive findings. Well, we're not really very confident at all they're real, but it's possible it's reflecting reality. So here you only have to be 20%. If you're 20% confident that this is real, that might be enough for you to say these are limited. Of course, that means it's much more likely to be not real, but that would be enough to go into limited. So I'm going to come back to this picture. These are some satirical guidelines, he described them, by Neil Pearce many years ago. And this was, he was talking about industry-funded studies, and he gave this as a sort of a way of how not to do things. And that was to only consider the study. This is really where industry perhaps funds a review of a study. So here he's imagining people just look at the study they've been asked to review, restrict themselves to the question of any chance the findings are wrong, list the biases but don't comment on the likely direction, conclude there are fatal flaws and it's uninterpretable, ask for better studies, and then start again. So clearly that is not the way to do epidemiology. And I've come up with another one myself for this meeting. And here I imagine the researcher does consider all the studies in the review, finds slight inconsistencies, and concludes the findings are inconsistent, and asks for better studies and starts again. So that's also not how to do things. Now, how does science take a wrong turning? And this list is a summary from a chap called Lee Smolin, and the book was about how physics, in his opinion, was going wrong. And it was about a group of physicists called string theory physicists, and he felt they were sort of taking over the discipline. And he was trying to work out what was going on. I don't know anything about string theory, but with this group, he felt there was overconfidence leading to feeling they were an elite and to self-entitlement. That it was an unusually monolithic community where everyone thought the same. That there was a strong boundary between this group and everyone else in the subject of physics. And there was near religious or political group loyalties. And there was a tendency to disregard the views of others. Of course, some of these are rather related. And this was picked up again. I didn't see this when it came out in 2006, but I heard about it more recently because a chap called Paul Romer used it to talk about macroeconomics. And the idea was that the macroeconomists hadn't picked up the financial crash. But now that was all over, they were just going back to life as normal, their discipline as normal. It didn't sort of matter that they hadn't been able to predict it. And he felt this group had the same, could be described in the same way. So I'm going to come back to that. Now, there have been some recent criticisms of IOP monographs and some of their decisions. And in part, it was a paper written by, in 2008, I think it was, by Paolo Beffetta, Carlo Lavecchia, and the late Joe McLaughlin. And this paper, I didn't read it at all as a criticism of IARC. It was a paper saying we should be very cautious about novel findings. Well, I think we would all agree with that. But there were clearly some people that took it, this was a sort of implied criticism of IARC, and they then started a correspondence. And the respondents, there was a number of letters from Paolo Veneas and Kurt Strafe, the current director of the monographs, and Vincent Cogliano, one of the previous directors, and Michael Hauptmann. And this was 2008 and 2009. And it's a very interesting set of correspondence because the people really start to get more and more annoyed with each other. And as they do that, they start to be perhaps more honest and say things they perhaps didn't mean to say, but they're telling you what they think. And then there's another person, and his name's Jeffrey Kabat, and he's an epidemiologist from America. I've never met him, but I find his work most impressive. And he wrote a book called Hyping Health Risks. And it's all about what happens when activists and newspapers get involved in a scientific topic and how politics comes in and funding and everything gets out of hand. And he writes a blog in something called the Forbes magazine, which I think perhaps is now an online blog rather than a magazine, I'm not sure. But he writes on health issues, and he's a very thoughtful man. So, what were these? And I've just taken some of the things out of all this set of correspondence. It was that an individual study may sometimes take an overly important role, particularly when authors are voting members of a panel that's reviewing it. And then, as this all got a bit more heated, this word careerism came in, and the notion that researchers would have a vested interest in advancing their own work. Now, on the other side, some people said, well, any things that are wrong here don't matter because we are taking the precautionary principle. And the response was that the precautionary principle relates to policy and politics and not science. And I think that is a crucial question in the argument between these people. And then this is more from Geoffrey Cabot's work. So he was saying that there's a fundamental conflict of interest when researchers evaluate their own work. And he also brought in this word activist, when he spoke about activist researchers. And this is where a researcher gets really very interested in their findings being taken up. And Cabot also made, it was really specific IARC assessments. He was not at all convinced by the evaluation that formaldehyde causes leukemia, neither of which am I. That there was limited evidence that cell phones cause brain cancer. Of course, a number of the IARC panel also didn't think it did, but the majority took the view. I also don't think it. I don't think the evidence is credible. And then Cabot, he didn't like the evaluation on coffee as a possible carcinogen and DDT. Now, the earlier papers and letters by Paolo Buffetta and his colleagues were all responded to by the authors I mentioned. So there was nothing really new to say about those. But now we have this paper written by Neil Pearce and 123 co-authors. So you must always be suspicious about something when there's 124 authors. And this is environmental health perspectives. And it's written by Neil Pearce. I'm not going to list all 124. Neil Pearce, who's a very bright man. Paolo Veneas, Aaron Blair, and they're listed first, and then the other authors are all in alphabetical order. So I assume it's mainly a paper from the first three, and the others have sort of added their names to it. So they say no, IARC working groups are free of conflict of interest. And what I think what they mean is that is financial conflicts of interest from industry, which is certainly the case. They know of no evidence to support the contention of careerism. So I'm not sure where they looked for evidence. Obviously not the News of the World, because it wouldn't be in there. But anyway, they know of no evidence. And then they say it's instructive that many votes are unanimous. Well, I'm not sure how many votes are unanimous. There's clearly quite a number of votes which are nearly unanimous. But for very difficult decisions, you wouldn't really expect things to be unanimous. It's instructive that no Group 1 classification has been reversed by another working group. Because when they did volume 100, they reviewed all the Group 1 carcinogens, and none of it was changed. But I'm not sure it is instructive in the way that the authors mean it to be here. Now, most importantly, these articles by Geoffrey Cabot were not saying that IARC has been no good and that the whole monograph programme is not an incredible achievement, which it is. His criticism was on specific evaluations. And they make no comments on these evaluations other than to state that only formaldehyde was a Group 1 classification. So they could have said, there's 124 of us, we've looked at the formaldehyde, and 100 of us think it was a good evaluation, the others don't. Nothing on that. And it's as if the other classifications, the limited evaluations, as if that doesn't matter, that it's too trivial an evaluation to even sort of, because you're only saying it's possible, therefore anything's possible. But the whole article, it can be read. I would read it as, do not criticise IARC. And that's a very, so from a scientific point of view, that's a very unattractive thing to say. But here we've got, so this was all, in my opinion, this was published because one scientist, Jeffrey Cabot, was making some perfectly reasonable points and bringing up important issues, and it takes 124 of them to respond to it. And Cabot will not be being invited to any of the meetings they run, I don't think. So how might the risk assessments take a wrong turning? And it's really the same list. Because that last paper that I put by Neil Pearce, and it's well worth reading, to me shows an unusually monolithic community. There's a whole number of criticisms being raised, and yet none of the authors find any of them have any value. So were they showing a near religious group loyalties? And was there a tendency to disregard the views of others? Well, perhaps. So on a slightly similar vein, well, it's similar in the sense it's another paper with a huge authorship. And this is a paper from Christopher Portier and 93 co-authors. And it's to do with glyphosate, because you know last year IARC said glyphosate was a probable carcinogen. And the European Food Safety Authority at the moment has said they are not concerned by glyphosate and they don't see it having a carcinogenic potential. And this paper was really about wanting to it was about policy. It wasn't really a scientific thing. So the question I've posed at the bottom here is are these people researchers or are they public health activists or are they both? They're clearly researchers. The question is, are they going over the boundary into being activists? And what does it all say? Well, it said IARC concluded the data for glyphosate meet the criteria for classification as a probable human carcinogen. So it's an interesting use of language. They're not saying, we believe glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. They say the data met the criteria for classification as, which is a much more legalistic definition. The EFSA said it's unlikely to pose a carcinogenic hazard to humans, and they weren't going to classify it in that way, and that there were serious flaws in the evaluation used by EFCA, and these shortcomings need to be corrected. Well, let's go back to this diagram. If we're now on the final column, if the IARC panel are saying the data in humans is limited, but you only need to be 20% confident that's real to get into the purple group, it could well be that the EFSA would say, well, we're only going to act if we're much more confident than that. So all these arguments could just be about a difference in view about how much data do you need to say you've got credible evidence. So what do I conclude from all this? Well, I think epidemiological findings always need to be interpreted cautiously, and I think in most individual papers they nearly always are. I think it is difficult to find a group of people with no conflicts of interest, but I don't think really there's any point in life gets more and more difficult if we start saying everyone's got a different conflict of interest, we can't hear them. We've got to have open discussion. I don't think evaluating your own work is ideal for a regulatory setting. I really like the idea where a different group of people come in to try and make sense of all the literature. But again, perhaps that's not, perhaps that's not practical. But what I do think is practical, and which I think would be very helpful, is I think there should be much better definitions of credible evidence and reasonable confidence. And it could be that diagram I've shown is really not the way that IARC looks at things at all, in which case it would be helpful to have a different to say more about what the framework is. And I think that might solve a lot of the, at least understand a lot of the disagreements. So I think the continued need for cancer evaluation by a number of different bodies, I think a single authority is dangerous. And authorities should be used, but we all need to make up our own minds. Obviously, industry doesn't have that option. It has to follow what the regulators say. But as scientists, we've all got to make up our own minds in the end. Many thanks.
2 brief interventions, 2 brief reactions.
Yeah, just one reaction to the difference in the criteria for classification. The IAC categorization is quite different from the classification criteria we have in the EU, for example. So we should not overlook that. And IAC can be a bit more uncertain in their assessment because it's only an advice. It doesn't have regulatory consequences, whereby the regulatory bodies tend to be a bit more stringent in their evaluation of the data, and there can be differences, in particular in that uncertainty area that you have depicted very nicely.
Thank you, Sylvia Jacobi and Professor Levy.
Thank you very much, and Len Levy. Tom, thank you very much. That was actually very helpful of giving a kind of perspective. And it's really linked to the question about negativity. It's the other side of the coin. You've talked about how you sort of go up the scale and then credibility to prove a positive and how much do you need, whether it's limited or sufficient. But going the other way, inadequate is essentially saying nothing is happening. How does it work in that direction in terms of the kind of values and the kind of perspective and the philosophy you've been doing? It doesn't seem equal in some way. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, you could now imagine that underneath my graph, there's also being confident about negative studies. I mean, what IARC seems to be doing at the moment is they're saying we're only going to say we're only going to say no evidence of carcinogenicity if you show it's a protective. If you've gone right the other way and you've shown something is protective, then you can say, right, that is not a carcinogen. But there's a huge space in between. And one of the points of this chap, Jeffrey Kabat, was he felt for the general public, it would be much more helpful to say, you know, a chemical has been looked at, and currently we do not believe it to be a carcinogen or whatever, rather than just saying there's an inadequate evidence that it is a carcinogen. In other words, the public needed a much... They could be helped a lot more by a different use of language, which I would agree with, I think.